For decades, scientists have believed depression is linked to lower levels of serotonin in the brain.
There's been a lot of fuss around the recently published scientific review article supposedly debunking the so-called serotonin hypothesis of depression. This hypothesis essentially states that depression is caused by a deficiency in the levels of serotonin, the neurotransmitter in the brain. Now, I believe a lot of the headlines published after this review came out have gotten the story all wrong. And in this video, I will give my pharmacologist's perspective on this topic. So stay tuned. Welcome to my channel. My name is Samuel Kohtala. I'm a neuropharmacologist studying the mechanisms of drug action in the brain. My channel is all about sharing an honest scientific perspective on various complex topics, hopefully in a manner that is understandable for most. And in this video, I will be taking a look at the recent controversy around the review that supposedly debunks the so-called serotonin hypothesis of depression. It all started with the publication of this systematic review, looking at the evidence for the serotonin theory of depression by Joanna Moncrief and colleagues. The abstract concludes that the main areas of serotonin research provide no consistent evidence of there being an association between serotonin and depression, and no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lower serotonin activity or concentrations. The study was quickly picked up by major news outlets with headlines such as "Little evidence that chemical imbalance causes depression, UCL scientists find," "Researchers question use of antidepressants prescribed to 1 in 6 in UK adults," and "Scientists have called into question the widespread use of antidepressants after a major review found no clear evidence that low serotonin levels are responsible for depression." Many prominent YouTubers were also commenting on this topic with similar remarks.
We all know what causes depression. It's low serotonin. Who told us that? It was the pharmaceutical companies. What possible reason could they have for that? They sell pharmaceutical products. That can't be the only reason, can it? Can it?
Because there's some new research from the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry that basically tells me that what I've been teaching for the past 25, 30 years is wrong. And what people have believed for the past 25, 30 years has been wrong. We've been getting this wrong.
To truly understand this topic, I'll need to start with a brief, or maybe not so brief, introduction to the history of antidepressant and monoamine research. And after that, I will be discussing some key expert opinions on this review article, while also giving you my own perspective. So stay all the way to the end. Now, the development of the first so-called antidepressant drugs began in the 1950s, after the serendipitous discovery of the antidepressant effects of the anti-tuberculosis agent isoniazid. It led the way for the development of a similar drug, iproniazid, which became the first pharmaceutical to be marketed solely for treating depression. The therapeutic effects were thought to rise from its action on the enzyme monoamine oxidase, responsible for the degradation of monoamines. The discovery was followed by a wave of novel monoamine oxidase inhibitors as well as tricyclic antidepressants. During the following decades, dozens of new antidepressants were developed following the basic pharmacological principles coined in the monoamine hypothesis or theory of depression. In particular, the monoamine hypothesis proposed that depression is a disease manifested by reduced levels of noradrenaline, dopamine, and/or serotonin in the brain, and that this could be counteracted by the inhibition of the enzyme responsible for breaking down these neurotransmitters. The advent of modern antidepressant drugs became most evident with the work that led to the discovery of fluoxetine in the 1970s. As a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, fluoxetine had a much more tolerable pharmacodynamic profile than the previous generation of antidepressants, like the tricyclics and the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And it also proved to be a massive commercial success. The efficacy of fluoxetine suggested that the selective regulation of serotonergic neurotransmission had antidepressant effects, and soon after, several new drugs appeared on the market with a similar mechanism of action. Following the success of SSRIs, other drugs that selectively targeted noradrenaline or noradrenaline and serotonin, or even drugs targeting other atypical mechanisms called atypical antidepressants, were developed. Despite the triumph of more selective antidepressants, which had obviously more reduced side effects, some tricyclic antidepressants are still in active clinical use, and their antidepressant effects are comparable to SSRIs. The monoamine hypothesis continued to gather support for a few decades until contrasting evidence started to emerge. The growing body of evidence against the monoamine hypothesis encouraged researchers to look for new neurobiological clues that could explain antidepressant effects beyond these simple monoaminergic neurotransmitters. Refinements to the original hypothesis were also made, such as the addition of new mechanistic layers, including the regulation of monoamine receptor dynamics. A hypothesis born out of these new ideas proposed that the regulation of neurotransmitter release by serotonin autoreceptors is crucial in explaining the delayed onset of action of antidepressant drugs. The idea here is that increasing serotonin leads to adaptive changes in the receptors it binds to. For example, the stimulation of 5-HT1A autoreceptors located in the raphe nucleus, where most serotonergic neural cell bodies reside, decreases the firing of these neurons and reduces the amount of serotonin released from neural projections, a phenomenon known to happen during physiological activity and acutely after SSRI treatment. Chronic treatment with SSRIs, however, results in the desensitization of 5-HT1A receptors, which leads to the disinhibition of neural activity and increased serotonergic neurotransmission. Other researchers also propose that these monoaminergic mechanisms are more modulatory in nature and may interact with other systems to produce antidepressant outcomes. They proposed, for example, that antidepressant effects may manifest through the modulation of function of the HPA axis by altering neurotrophin signaling or through effects on immune systems and various intracellular cascades. Indeed, many of these areas of research have gathered increasing attention in the last decades. The wide array of non-antidepressant applications of antidepressant drugs and the discovery of the regulation of neurotrophic factors by antidepressants formed the basis for the so-called neurotrophin hypothesis of depression. This important hypothesis revolves around the idea of depression being the consequence of insufficient neurotrophic signaling, leading to impaired connectivity and survival of neurons, especially in brain areas important for mood regulation. This hypothesis is supported by the preclinical findings that stress and glucocorticoid injections could decrease the expression of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and promote atrophy of hippocampal neurons, while chronic antidepressant treatment, electroconvulsive shock, or even exercise could prevent this downregulation in rodents. Subsequently, neurotrophic factors and plasticity-related signaling pathways became a major branch of depression research. In addition to the neurotrophin hypothesis, a network hypothesis was proposed. While the neurotrophin hypothesis essentially replaces serotonin deficiency with a deficiency in neurotrophic factors, the network hypothesis postulated that the amelioration of depression is the result of increased plasticity and consecutive adaptations in neural networks, and this network rewiring could be modified by increasing neuroplasticity through antidepressant drugs and activity-dependent processes. Many other important lines of research also exist, but I won't be going into too much detail here. As one example, several studies suggest that depressed patients have impairments of emotional processing. Studies have found that depressed patients exhibit a selective attention towards negative facial expressions while having deficits in the decoding of positive emotions, and that serotonergic drugs may modulate these brain functions, perhaps contributing to their therapeutic effects. Now, I hope that this brief review of some of the historical aspects of antidepressant research demonstrates that the field has not remained fixated on the serotonin hypothesis of depression for the past 50 years or so. What is true is that the serotonin hypothesis has undoubtedly been very influential, but research has since evolved into completely new directions, and hardly anyone in the field still thinks that serotonin is the root cause of everything.
Zoloft, a prescription medicine, can help. It works to correct a chemical imbalance in the brain which may be related to symptoms of depression. You just shouldn't have to feel this way anymore. Only your doctor can diagnose depression. Zoloft is not for everyone.
And yes, medical doctors and pharmacists still sometimes explain the effects of antidepressant drugs using the monoamine or serotonin hypothesis, but that is largely due to the fact that when they were studying, that was the cutting edge of science. And to be frank, it remains a decent, oversimplified way to explain a difficult concept to someone without the in-depth neurobiological or psychological knowledge of how the human brain works. Now, another thing that might be shocking to some is that medical doctors don't really understand how antidepressants work. But do we really need to understand how these drugs work to use them as treatments? I mean, antidepressants are hardly the ideal treatments for curing depression, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that they are a viable therapeutic option for not one, but many psychiatric disorders. Just like we don't know the specifics of how anesthesia works, it still works, and we can go to surgery and not have to experience a surgeon cutting you up. I really doubt that the reason people are taking antidepressants is the chemical imbalance theory they've been fed, but rather they're taking antidepressants because they are depressed. And no matter what the mechanism, if it's helpful, it's helpful. Now let's go through some other points and discuss some key expert opinions. One of them is from Professor Gitte Moos-Knudsen, a well-known translational neurobiologist and a clinical neurologist. She highlights that a major misconception is the notion that depression is a single, well-defined disease with a single biochemical deficit. As Professor Knudsen puts it, quote, "Today it is largely accepted that depression is a heterogeneous disorder with potentially multiple underlying causes. The review aims to uncover existing evidence for a serotonergic deficit, but the studies in the review use methodologies that only generate proxies for the real question, which is if synaptic 5-HT concentrations and release are altered in subsets of patients with major depression." Professor David Nutt, another well-known neuropsychopharmacologist, is pretty much on the same page here, saying, quote, "Unfortunately, all of these variables are indirect measures of serotonin function, or even worse, as in the case of gene linkage studies, merely proxies for serotonin activity. It is only recently that we have developed the technology to measure serotonin release in the living human brain, and in the first study of this type, currently under review, we did find decreased serotonin release capacity in people with depression. So, to dismiss the serotonin hypothesis of depression at this point is premature," unquote. So it appears that the serotonin hypothesis may not be debunked after all. At least not by this particular review. The truth is, in fact, much more complex. Even if we were to find out that monoamines have nothing to do with antidepressant effects, it would not make antidepressants any less effective. And the problem is that publishing papers in such a controversial tone is very prone to causing problems, for example, in the patient-clinician relationship, or causing some depressed patients to quit taking their medications. Finally, it is important to note that the main authors of this study, Dr. Joanna Moncrief and Dr. Mark Horowitz, have made much of their careers by criticizing the use of drug treatment for mental health disorders and the mechanisms of action of psychiatric drugs. While these critical opinions are important for the field, and undoubtedly they have valid points in, for example, highlighting the overprescription of psychiatric drugs, one must also keep in mind that they have a lot to gain from the controversy and the following sale of books, etc., etc. Previously, Dr. Moncrief, for example, has criticized ketamine, saying that, quote, the American Psychiatric Association does not explain how these so-called antidepressant effects can be distinguished from the euphoria and other mental alterations associated with acute ketamine intoxication, unquote, and he has also downplayed psychedelic drugs as the new psychiatric craze. Now, these are a little bit out of the context, but still it kind of demonstrates that she seems to have quite strong opinions against all psychopharmacological treatments in general. And I can understand that she stands firmly to protect and to promote psychotherapy as a treatment option, and indeed it is an effective treatment option that should be utilized more, but it's hardly the solution for treating all depressed patients. And I think a lot of psychiatrists working on treating patients with treatment-resistant depression would agree that the more treatment options we have available generally tends to provide better treatment outcomes for the patients that may not respond to some other treatment. So having more treatment options, in my opinion, is better. I'll leave it at that. Let me know in the comments what you think about this whole controversy around the serotonin hypothesis of depression. And also remember to subscribe to my channel and press like to support my work. Thank you for watching, and until next time.